Hello, and may peace find your heart. Today, we will touch on one of the most difficult and painful topics of the spiritual journey, God's silence. Have you ever felt this? The feeling that your prayers bounce off the ceiling? That you cry out for direction and answer, comfort. And on the other side, there is only silence. It's a feeling that can generate doubt, anguish, and even a crisis of faith. The great Christian writer C.S. Lewis, author of the Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity, knew this pain intimately. After his wife's death, he wrote that his prayers seemed to encounter a door locked with all the bolts. He experienced firsthand what it's like to cry out in the dark. But it is precisely in Lewis's work and life that we find keys to deciphering this mystery. What we will do today is investigate the secret behind God's silence. What if I told you that, according to Lewis, God's silence is not absence, but a form of profound communication? What if it's not a sign of abandonment, but of intense work behind the scenes of your soul? Stay with me, because the lessons we'll learn can transform the way you view these desert periods. And if you know someone going through this, share this video. It might be the light they need. Don't forget to subscribe and like to strengthen our community. Silence as God's megaphone. The first great lesson we learn from Lewis comes from his work The Problem of Pain. In it, he famously says, God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. Pain is his megaphone to awaken a deaf world. I want to propose an adaptation. Silence is also God's megaphone. Think about it. When everything is going well, when we feel God's presence and hear his answers, it's easy to rely on our own strength. We thank God, but deep down our self-sufficiency remains intact. We control the situation. Divine silence has the power to shatter this illusion. It forces us to stop. When our strategies fail, when our wisdom is exhausted and there is no voice from heaven to guide us to the next step, what are we left with? Silence creates a vacuum, a sacred space. It is in this space that we are forced to confront the true nature of our faith. Is our faith in God or in God's answers? Do we love the Creator or just his gifts? C.S. Lewis would say that silence is like the moment when a teacher stops teaching and hands out tests. The absence of the teacher's voice does not mean he has abandoned the room. On the contrary, his silence is an act of trust, an invitation for the student to access all that has already been taught and apply the knowledge. God's silence asks you today, what do you truly believe when emotions and answers are gone? Do you trust me, or just what I do for you? The megaphone of silence doesn't shout with words, but with their absence, awakening us to a dependence we could never achieve through noise. Aslan is not a tamed lion, the sovereignty of God. The second lesson comes from the magical world of Narnia, but it is profoundly theological. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the children ask about Aslan, the Christ figure in that story. They ask if he is a tame, docile lion. Mr. Beaver's response is one of Lewis's most important lines, tame. He's not a tame lion, but he is good. What does this teach us about God's silence? It teaches us that God is sovereign. He is not a genie in a bottle, a virtual assistant, or a power we can control with the right words in our prayers. He is God. He comes and goes according to his perfect will and wisdom, not according to our agenda. Often, our despair in silence stems from a misplaced expectation. We want a tamed lion, a God who answers in our time, in our way. When he doesn't, we feel something is wrong. Lewis invites us to mature. God's silence can be an act of teaching us that his ways are higher than ours. Perhaps the answer we seek would destroy us. Perhaps the direction we ask for would lead us down a shorter, but less glorious path. In Narnia, Aslan was not always present. His absence forced the kings and queens to be courageous, to use the wisdom he had given them, to rule justly on their own. Aslan's silence was an invitation to them to mature. In the same way, God's silence can be his invitation for you to stop being a spiritual child, dependent on instructions at every step, and become a mature son, acting based on the principles he already knows, trusting in the Father's character, even when he doesn't hear his voice. Silence, in this case, is not an absence of care. It is the Father's trust that says, I have already given you what you need for this phase. Walk, fight, trust. I am watching. Faith that resists the fog-faced fears. Feelings, the third lesson, is perhaps the most practical and comes from Lewis's masterpiece, Mere Christianity. He knew that the Christian life has ups and downs, or, as he himself describes in another book, peaks and valleys. God's silence often plunges us into a valley of emotional fog. Our feelings of faith fade, joy fades, certainty turns to doubt. And this is where the enemy, as Lewis would describe it, strikes hardest. He whispers, see, God has abandoned you. It was all an illusion. What is Lewis's answer to this? He says that faith is not primarily a feeling. Faith is the virtue of holding fast to what your reason has accepted as truth, despite the shifting of your emotions. In other words, God's silence is the acid test that reveals whether your faith is anchored on the rock of truth or the shifting sand of your feelings. The practical lesson here is, when the fog of silence descends, don't trust your feelings. Trust what you knew to be true in moments of clarity. Remember the times God spoke. Reread his promises in the Bible. Remember the character of God you knew in the light. Faith, for Lewis, is making a conscious choice to believe in God's goodness and presence, even when every fiber of your being feels otherwise. It's saying, my feelings tell me I'm alone, but truth tells me he will never leave me nor forsake me. Today, I choose to stand with truth. This act of will, this holy stubbornness, is the faith that pleases God and the strength that will carry you through the valley until the sun shines again. So, what is the secret behind God's silence? Through the lens of C.S. Lewis, we learn that silence is not a void, but a tool. It is the megaphone that awakens us to real dependence. It is the proof of the sovereignty of a lion that is not tamed, but is good, inviting us to maturity. And it is the test that forges true faith, based on commitment, not feelings. In his moments of greatest pain, Lewis compared God to a cosmic surgeon. A surgeon, to heal, must cut. And during the operation, he may not explain every step to the patient. The surgeon's silence is not a sign of hatred, but of total concentration on healing. Perhaps the silence you experience today is the concentrated silence of the divine surgeon, who is performing profound work in your soul. A work that the noise of immediate responses would only hinder. If this message spoke to you, I invite you to leave in the comments, Lord, I trust in your process, even in silence. Let's create a chain of faith for all who are going through this desert. Subscribe, like, and share. Your journey doesn't have to be lonely. Remember, the teacher is silent during the test. Trust what you have already learned and know that his presence fills the room, even if his voice is not heard. Be at peace.